I never thought my own father would say it out loud, especially not in front of everyone who mattered. My name is Gretchen. I am 29, and I was standing in a local community hall surrounded by relatives when everything changed at once. The gathering was supposed to be normal, familiar faces, polite conversations, nothing that needed much attention. I had learned how to stay quiet in those rooms, how to keep my body still, how to listen without showing what I felt. That night, staying quiet did not protect me. He raised his voice without stopping, loud enough to stop nearby conversations, loud enough to make people turn around. He did not lower his voice or make his words softer. He looked straight at me and said, "You'll never amount to anything." The sentence landed exactly where he wanted it to, not as an opinion, not as frustration, but as a final decision spoken out loud. I did not argue. I did not ask him to stop. I did not explain myself. I looked at him and replied, "Maybe you're right." I said it calmly, without sarcasm, without emotion, because anything stronger would have given him control of the moment. I picked up my keys and walked out. I did not wait for reactions or apologies or shocked expressions. I stepped outside, got into my car, and drove away without looking back, letting the noise stay behind me where it belonged. A few hours later, while I was still trying to steady my breathing, my phone buzzed. It was a message from a relative who had stayed behind. The words were short, careful, almost hesitant. "Do you know what he did after you left? Before this goes any further, take a moment to subscribe and stay with me. If you have ever stayed silent to survive a moment like this, you may recognize what came next." Before that night, I had learned to live with certain rules inside my family. Dad believed order mattered more than comfort, and he decided what was right and wrong in ways that kept him in control. His opinions were treated like final decisions, not because they were always fair, but because questioning them only made things worse. I learned early that staying agreeable was safer than being honest, even when honesty would have cost me less than silence did over time. Nothing I did was ever openly terrible, yet everything I did seemed to fall just short of his approval. The problem was never a specific mistake that could be fixed. It was the idea that I needed constant fixing. If I spoke too directly, I was called difficult. If I stayed quiet, I was told I lacked initiative. There was always something slightly off, always a reason to remind me I was not quite measuring up. My mother played a quieter role in all of this. My mother preferred calm over confrontation, even when calm came at someone else's expense. She would lower her eyes when conversations turned sharp, offering small gestures instead of protection. Her silence was never loud, but it was consistent, and over time, it became another rule I learned not to challenge. My brother Daniel fit easily into the space our father valued most. He understood when to speak, when to agree, and when to stay aligned with the expectations set for him. His position in the family was never announced or defended. It simply existed, reinforced through everyday decisions that made it clear whose choices carried weight. I noticed the difference without needing it explained, and I learned to work around it rather than fight it. The family gathering that night had been planned weeks in advance, framed as something simple and necessary. It was meant to bring relatives together, strengthen connections, and show that everything was working the way it should. I was expected to attend, not because my presence mattered, but because not showing up would have raised questions that no one wanted to answer. Saying no was never presented as an option. I went because avoiding conflict had become second nature, and because I had convinced myself it would pass like the others always had. I knew how to stay calm, how to respond politely, how to make myself small enough to avoid attention. What I did not expect was a shift in tone, the moment when criticism stopped being hinted at and became something declared openly. Looking back, the pattern was obvious. This was never about one comment or one night. It was about years of quiet judgments that had finally found a public voice. I had been corrected in private often enough that the only thing new about that moment was the audience. The words themselves were familiar, even if the setting was not. That was the difference that mattered. Being made small behind closed doors teaches endurance. Being made small in front of others changes how everything is seen. It turns a private imbalance into something shared, something that no longer belongs only to the people involved. What happened that night did not come out of nowhere, but it crossed a line that could not be stepped back from, whether anyone was ready to admit it or not. A few hours after I left the building, my phone lit up with a message I did not expect to receive that night. It was from my Aunt Lorraine, and the tone was careful in a way that immediately felt different. She did not ask how I was doing or whether I had made it home safely. She wrote that she thought I should know something before I heard it from someone else. I stared at the screen for a long moment before responding, already sensing that whatever came next was not going to make the night easier to process. Lorraine explained that after I walked out, Dad did not follow me or try to calm the situation. Instead, he stayed behind and spoke privately with the people responsible for running the community hall. He waited until the room had settled before approaching them, choosing a moment when his voice would sound reasonable rather than emotional. According to her, he framed the conversation as concern, not anger, which made it far more effective. He asked them to document what he called an incident involving me. He did not describe it as a family disagreement or a misunderstanding that got bigger. He described it as a disruption that needed to be noted for future reference. Lorraine said he was careful with his language, avoiding anything that sounded personal while still making his point clear enough to carry weight. Dad told them I had been agitated, unpredictable, and inappropriate for a shared community space. He suggested that my behavior showed ongoing issues rather than a single moment. He did not raise his voice, and he did not make the scene sound bigger than it was. Instead, he focused on character, hinting at instability without ever using the word directly. The result was worse than a dramatic accusation because it sounded calm, deliberate, and responsible. What I did not realize until Lorraine explained it was how easily his words were accepted. The organizers listened, nodded, and took notes. They trusted him because he had been involved with the community for years, because he knew how to present himself as someone looking out for the greater good. No one asked for my version of events. No one questioned whether his account matched what actually happened. By the end of that conversation, my name had been added to an internal report. It was not dramatic or visible, just a record that would quietly follow me. Lorraine said it was framed as routine documentation, something done to ensure future gatherings remained safe and orderly. Hearing that made my stomach tighten in a way that felt different from embarrassment or anger. The impact became clearer later that night when I checked my email. A community program I had been informally connected to sent a brief message saying my participation was being placed on hold. There was no explanation beyond a vague reference to recent concerns. The wording was polite, almost apologetic, which made it harder to argue against. It was not a rejection, but it was a pause that carried consequences. Sitting alone with that information, I began to understand what had really happened. This was not an emotional reaction to being challenged in public. This was a calculated move designed to take back control once the audience was gone. Dad had not lashed out because he was upset. He had waited until he could shape the story quietly, knowing that silence would do more damage than confrontation. What unsettled me most was how familiar the pattern suddenly felt. This was the same approach he had used within the family for years, just applied on a larger scale. The difference was that now it involved institutions, records, and opportunities that extended beyond private relationships. It was no longer just about how I was treated at home. I did not respond to Lorraine right away. I needed time to sit with the realization that this had been planned, not improvised. Understanding that distinction changed how I saw everything that followed. It told me that whatever came next would not be accidental either. Not long after that, the consequences of that decision began to surface in ways I could not ignore. 2 days later, I stopped reacting and started paying closer attention to what had been quietly ignored for years. I went back through conversations, messages, and moments I had dismissed as uncomfortable but harmless at the time. What stood out was not any single incident, but a familiar pattern that suddenly felt impossible to unsee. Dad had always positioned himself as someone protecting order, yet the way he enforced that order consistently benefited him. Whenever someone challenged his authority, the response was rarely direct, and the consequences appeared later, framed as unrelated issues. The more I examined the past, the clearer it became that I was not the first person he had handled this way. Lorraine shared details I had never been told before, speaking carefully, as if she were testing how much truth I was ready to hear. She described other situations where Dad had raised concerns behind closed doors, always with the same calm language and measured tone. He never accused anyone openly, and he never confronted people in ways that could be questioned. Instead, he documented, reported, and suggested patterns of behavior that others accepted without looking deeper. Lorraine explained that in those cases, the people involved often felt confused rather than angry. Opportunities disappeared, invitations stopped arriving, and explanations remained vague. Most of them assumed the problem was their own behavior, not realizing how the story had been shaped before they even knew a discussion was happening. Hearing this shifted something in me because it placed my experience within a larger framework that extended well beyond family dynamics. When word began circulating among relatives, reactions came quietly rather than confrontationally. Some expressed concern without offering support, while others chose distance under the excuse of staying neutral. Conversations became shorter, responses slower, and invitations more selective. It was not open hostility, but it was not loyalty either. The family did not divide into clear sides, and no one openly defended me, which made the silence feel heavier than direct opposition. What surprised me most was how quickly the focus moved away from what Dad had done and toward how I should handle it. I was advised to be patient, to let things settle, to avoid making the situation bigger. The underlying message was clear even when it went unspoken. Preserving the existing structure mattered more than questioning the way it worked. My discomfort was treated as an unfortunate side effect rather than a problem worth addressing. As I listened to these responses, it became obvious that this was never just about a strained relationship between a father and a daughter. It was about who controlled the story and who absorbed the consequences. Dad did not need agreement to maintain power. He needed compliance, and the family had learned over time that compliance kept things predictable. Challenging that arrangement threatened stability, which made people uncomfortable enough to look away. Understanding this reframed the situation entirely. The issue was not misunderstanding or hurt feelings that could be resolved through conversation. It was a system built around authority that discouraged accountability. Once I recognized that, the emotional weight shifted. I stopped wondering what I could have done differently and started asking why the same patterns were allowed to continue unchecked. That realization did not bring relief, but it brought clarity. It explained why no one stepped in and why Dad felt confident acting the way he did. Power works best when it appears reasonable, and his control had been disguised as responsibility for so long that few people questioned it. Seeing the structure clearly meant I could no longer pretend this was an isolated incident, and it forced me to accept that the problem was larger than a single night or a single comment. About a week later, I stopped avoiding the inevitable and decided to face it directly. I asked Dad to meet me in person, not to argue, but to hear him explain what he had done without intermediaries or softened versions passed through others. When we sat down, I spoke carefully, choosing words that left little room for deflection. I told him I knew he had contacted the organizers and described me in ways that damaged my standing. I asked him why he believed that was justified, and I waited for an answer that acknowledged responsibility. He did not hesitate. He leaned back and dismissed the situation as something I had misunderstood. He said I was reading too much into it, that my reactions had always been too big, and that my sensitivity created problems where none existed. According to him, nothing he did was harmful, and if consequences followed, they were simply the result of how others saw my behavior. His tone stayed steady, almost reassuring, as if reframing events should have been enough to end the conversation. I pushed back, explaining that documented claims do not exist in a vacuum, and that labeling someone as unstable carries real consequences. He interrupted me, insisting that his intentions were protective, not punishing. He claimed he was preventing potential issues and maintaining standards, not targeting me personally. Listening to him speak, I realized how deeply rehearsed the story was, polished through years of repetition without challenge. Daniel stepped in before I could respond further. He told me I was making the situation worse by refusing to let it go. He said family matters should stay private, and that continuing this conversation would only embarrass everyone involved. He urged me to stay quiet, to think about appearances, and to remember that reputations, once damaged, are difficult to repair. His concern was not about what had happened, but about how it might look if the conflict continued. That moment clarified everything. Every attempt I made to explain myself was redirected toward preserving the image of unity. Accountability was treated as disruption, while silence was praised as maturity. I could see how the structure worked now, not through force, but through subtle pressure to comply. Speaking the truth was framed as selfish, while absorbing harm was framed as responsibility. I told them both that I was done trying to be understood within a system that required my silence to function. I said that continuing to participate meant accepting a version of myself I did not recognize, one defined by other people's comfort rather than my own reality. My words did not raise voices or cause outrage. Yet the room felt tense because I had stopped negotiating. Dad responded by warning me that withdrawing would isolate me. He said, "Families do not work that way, and that distance creates regret." Daniel echoed him, adding that walking away would be seen as dramatic and unnecessary. Neither of them asked what I needed or acknowledged what had been taken from me. Their concern stayed focused on stability, not fairness. I listened without interrupting, then stated my decision clearly. I told them I was stepping away from family gatherings, shared events, and informal obligations. I explained that this was not punishment or revenge, but a boundary that I needed to protect myself. I said I would no longer attend spaces where my presence required silence or self-erasure. The reaction was quiet rather than explosive. Dad accused me of overreacting once more, while Daniel shook his head as if disappointed. There was no attempt to compromise or understand my perspective. That absence confirmed what words could not. This structure did not bend, and it did not listen. Walking away from that conversation felt heavier than leaving the hall days earlier. Yet it also felt final. I was no longer hoping for acknowledgement or repair. I understood that staying would mean continuing a role I had outgrown. Leaving meant uncertainty, but it also meant honesty. For the first time, my decision was not shaped by fear of consequences, but by clarity about what I was no longer willing to accept. Not long after that, the consequences began to spread beyond my family, moving into spaces where my last name had always been treated as neutral, until it suddenly was not. The shift was subtle at first. Conversations at work changed tone without explanation. Invitations stopped arriving, and people who used to speak openly around me became careful with their words. I was not confronted directly, yet I could feel something had been placed between me and the community I had spent years building. It became clear that the version of me being passed around was no longer shaped by my actions, but by a story I had no access to and no control over. I learned through indirect comments that concerns had been raised about my behavior, framed as quiet warnings rather than accusations. I was described as unpredictable, difficult to work with, and emotionally unstable in ways that felt deliberately vague. No specific incident was ever named, which made the damage harder to address. When reputation is questioned without details, denial sounds defensive even when it is truthful. This began to affect my professional standing. A community-based opportunity one had been preparing for was paused without explanation, followed by a polite message that circumstances had changed. I was told it was temporary, though no timeline was offered. The phrasing suggested caution rather than rejection, but caution alone was enough to stall momentum I could not easily rebuild. I understood then that the impact was not accidental and that silence was being used as proof against me. Colleen, my best friend, noticed the shift before I explained it. She did not push for details or encourage confrontation. Instead, she listened while I spoke through what had happened, allowing me to finish without interrupting or making the weight of it seem smaller. Her presence grounded me during a period when I began questioning my own perceptions, which felt more destabilizing than the external consequences themselves. Despite the growing pressure, I chose not to respond publicly. I did not issue statements, defend myself online, or try to correct the story circulating through informal channels. I understood that anything I said would be filtered through the same lens that had already labeled me a problem. Staying quiet was not an admission of guilt, but a refusal to perform for a system that rewarded compliance over truth. What I did not expect was how that silence began to change the direction of the story. Without my reaction to point at, attention slowly shifted back to the source. Questions began circulating within the community about why concerns were raised without evidence, and why official channels were used to address what had allegedly been a personal issue. A few people started asking how many times similar warnings had been filed and against whom. I learned that this was not the first time my father had stepped in on community matters under the guise of concern. Others had experienced similar situations years earlier, though none had been as visible as mine. The pattern was quiet but consistent, relying on authority rather than accountability. This time, However, the lack of reaction from me left room for scrutiny rather than distraction. Eventually, the organizers who had paused my opportunity reached out again, this time asking questions instead of delivering decisions. They wanted clarity about the original complaint, documentation to support it, and context that had previously been assumed unnecessary. The absence of proof became difficult to ignore, and the credibility of the report began to weaken. I was not restored overnight, nor did the damage disappear completely. Trust does not return on command, especially when doubt has been introduced deliberately. Still, the story that had once moved freely now faced resistance, and the authority behind it no longer went unexamined. I realized that while silence had cost me in the short term, it had also prevented me from reinforcing a story that was never mine to carry. By choosing not to engage, I had removed myself from the role I was expected to play. The consequences were real, but they were no longer one-sided. For the first time, the influence my father relied on was being questioned, not by me, but by the very structures he had used to control the story. Several weeks later, the shift that had been slow and subtle finally became impossible to ignore. What started as quiet questions inside the community turned into formal reviews of past decisions that Dad had influenced over the years. People began pulling old records, meeting notes, and informal reports that had once been accepted without hesitation. Patterns emerged that no one had wanted to name before. Complaints that were labeled as concerns. Warnings that never included evidence. Situations where authority replaced fairness under the cover of responsibility. Dad's role in the community changed almost overnight. Invitations stopped arriving. His opinions were no longer treated as final. When meetings happened, his words were written down instead of accepted at face value. The respect he once commanded through confidence alone began to fade, replaced by polite distance and careful language. No one confronted him directly, but the silence around him felt different from the silence that had surrounded me earlier. This time, it carried doubt rather than dismissal. The family could not shield him anymore. For years, internal loyalty had worked as a buffer, smoothing over his actions before they reached the surface. Now that buffer cracked. Relatives who once deflected questions started stepping back. Some avoided the topic entirely. Others admitted they did not want to be involved. The unspoken agreement to protect appearances no longer held, especially once external eyes were watching. Daniel noticed the change before Dad acknowledged it. His position had always depended on staying aligned with the right side of authority, but that side was no longer stable. Conversations that once felt confident became cautious. He stopped speaking on behalf of the family in public spaces. When he did speak, he measured each word carefully, as if testing the ground beneath him. The confidence he used to carry like armor now looked like something he was afraid to lose. I watched all of this without stepping in. I did not provide documents or push for accountability. I did not correct stories or point out contradictions. The systems Dad relied on were doing the work on their own. When authority is built on control rather than trust, it does not need opposition to collapse. It only needs attention. At home, the dynamic shifted as well. Conversations that once revolved around expectations and compliance grew shorter and more strained. Dad dismissed the situation as misunderstanding at first, then as overreaction. When those explanations failed, he blamed external pressure and people who lacked context. None of that changed the outcome. Influence depends on credibility, and credibility does not survive repeated scrutiny. Daniel approached me once during this period, speaking more carefully than I had ever heard him speak. He did not apologize or acknowledge what had happened to me directly. Instead, he asked whether I planned to get involved, as if my silence had become its own source of uncertainty. I told him the truth. I had no intention of stepping back into a structure that had already shown me how it worked. My role was finished. That answer unsettled him more than anger ever could. Without my participation, there was no familiar balance to return to. The hierarchy, he understood, depended on someone absorbing pressure quietly. When that stopped, everyone had to adjust. By then, I was already preparing my final decision. It was not sudden, and it was not emotional. It was practical. I reviewed what staying connected would require and what it would cost. I compared that to the life I was building without constant correction, justification, or silence. The contrast was clear. The community consequences continued to unfold without my involvement. Dad lost his informal authority, then his formal roles. Committees reorganized. Responsibilities were reassigned. His name no longer carried weight by default. None of this was framed as punishment. It was presented as procedure, which made it impossible to argue against without exposing the very patterns under review. I did not feel satisfaction watching this happen. What I felt was clarity. The harm done to me had never been personal in the way I once believed. It was structural. Once the structure was questioned, everything built on it weakened. By the time I finished making my plans, the outcome was certain. The distance I had created was no longer temporary. It was necessary. I was not walking away in anger or waiting for closure that would never come. I was choosing a future where my worth was not negotiated inside someone else's system. The consequences had turned back on their source, not because I pushed them, but because I stepped aside and let them move forward on their own. 3 months later, the distance between my old life and my current one felt permanent rather than temporary. The consequences that once seemed unclear had become visible in real ways. Dad no longer held the informal authority he relied on for years. Invitations stopped coming. His opinion was no longer treated as a shortcut to agreement, and people who once defended him now avoided speaking on his behalf. Those who had openly supported him experienced quieter consequences of their own, losing influence and credibility as the structure they depended on slowly collapsed. No one framed it as punishment, yet the shift was undeniable and irreversible. For me, life settled into a rhythm that no longer revolved around anticipation or self-correction. I'd built routines without checking how they might be interpreted by family expectations. My work became more focused because it was no longer filtered through anxiety about reputation. Social connections felt lighter because I did not need to explain absence or justify boundaries. The space I created allowed clarity to replace constant watchfulness, and that clarity became the foundation of everything that followed. The decision to cut ties completely did not come from anger or a desire to prove anything. It came from understanding patterns with enough distance to see them clearly. Reconciliation would have required returning to a dynamic where my worth was negotiable, where silence was treated as compliance, and where accountability was always redirected. I chose not to offer another opportunity for that cycle to repeat. There were no final arguments or dramatic exits. I stopped responding, stopped attending, and stopped explaining. The separation was quiet but firm. Without my presence, the family story struggled to hold its shape. Attempts to pull me back were indirect and inconsistent, often framed as concern rather than responsibility. I did not engage. Distance was no longer a reaction, but a decision rooted in self-respect. Over time, the absence became normalized, and the pressure to return faded. As people adjusted to a reality where I was no longer available to stabilize tension or absorb discomfort. What surprised me most was how little effort it took to maintain this boundary once it was in place. The fear that once came with stepping away dissolved as my life filled with purpose rather than defense. I learned that peace does not require constant negotiation when the cost of negotiation is dignity. My sense of value no longer depended on recognition from those who refused to see it. Family does not grant anyone the right to make your value smaller or rewrite your reality. Respect is not earned through endurance, nor is loyalty proven by silence. Self-respect sometimes begins with leaving spaces that demand you shrink to belong. Walking away is not weakness when staying requires you to abandon who you are. Choosing yourself can be the most honest response to years of control and dismissal. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. Your time and attention mean more than you may realize. If any part of this journey connected with you, I invite you to share your thoughts and experiences in the comments. Different perspectives matter, and your voice could help someone else feel less alone in their decision.